Okay, guys, before we talk about Christianity, we need to talk about the Roman Empire. Not just what it was, but what it wanted, because Rome wasn't just a military machine. It was a psychological engine, an empire of narrative. Control the story, control the people. That was always the game. Now, in the first century, the Roman Empire had a problem. The Jewish population in Judea was rebellious, deeply spiritual, and resistant to Roman domination. They had their own laws, their own scriptures, and most importantly, they didn't bend. Rome had crushed revolts before, but this was different. You couldn't just kill your way out of a spiritual rebellion. You needed to outmaneuver it. And here's where things begin to shift. See, the Romans were practical. They didn't care what gods you worshipped until the gods started threatening the order of the state. But Judaism was different. It wasn't just a religion, it was an identity. And it was a powerful, structured, ancient, deeply rooted in law and tradition. The Romans couldn't just erase it, so instead they studied it. They saw how Jewish law unified people, how the Torah created a shared worldview, a common moral code, and a centralized authority. And that was power. And Rome took notes. In the years following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, the Jewish world was in crisis. Priestly authority collapsed, the people were scattered, and out of this chaos, new voices emerged. Some radical, some mystical, some deeply critical of the temple system that had fallen. Among them, the Messianic Jews, those who believed a savior figure had come or would come to liberate them not just from sin, but from Rome itself. Now imagine you're Rome. You see this energy, this hunger, this spark of revolutionary fire. You don't want to crush it. You want to redirect it. You want to take that spark and put it in a lamp that you can carry. And that's where the groundwork for Christianity is laid. Let's be blunt. Rome didn't create Jesus, but they absolutely created the version of Jesus that history preserved. Because if you go back to the early records, the historical Jews were a threat. The historical Jesus was a threat, not the historical Jews. And he was a Jewish mystic, a rebel, possibly a revolutionary who challenged both the temple elite and the Roman rule. He didn't teach submission, he taught awakening. He didn't form a church, he formed a movement. But that by the time the dust settled, what we got was a sanitized version of his life, presented not through the lens of his own people, but through Roman-educated scribes, many of whom wrote in Greek for Roman audiences, with Roman objectives in mind. Let's talk about Paul. Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paul, was a Roman citizen trained in Greek rhetoric, steeped in Jewish law, and fluent in the politics of empire. He never met Jesus in life, but he became the single most influential architect of Christian theology. And what did Paul do? He took the message of Jesus and reframed it, not as a liberation movement for the oppressed, but as a universal salvation plan that required obedience to faith rather than action, obedience to grace rather than rebellion. And suddenly the message shifts. The Jesus who said the kingdom is within you becomes the Christ who demands loyalty. The mystic becomes a sacrifice. The revolutionary becomes a lamb. And that's not a coincidence. That's marketing. That's empire strategy. Paul's letters, which predate the Gospels, are full of Roman ideological fingerprints: submission to authority, endurance under suffering, the glorification of weakness, the rejection of rebellion. In Romans 13:1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. And that's not prophecy, that's propaganda. And over time, that message became the foundation. The Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, weren't written by eyewitnesses. They were compiled decades after Jesus' death, shaped by oral traditions, theological agendas, and imperial pressures. Each one was tailored to a different audience, Jewish, Gentile, Roman, and each one carefully navigated the political tensions of its time. What we're left with is not a biography of a man, it's a political document, a myth wrapped around a memory. And the church that grew from it didn't just survive the empire, it became the empire. But we'll get to that. Once Rome saw the potential of this new faith, they did what empires always do with power. They institutionalized it, they standardized it, they made it useful. By the early 4th century, Christianity had spread fast, but it was fractured. Different communities were teaching different things. Some believed Jesus was purely divine. Others saw him as fully human. Some held tightly to Jewish law. Others rejected it completely. And floating beneath all of it was Gnostic thought. Esoteric, mystical, dangerous to authority. To the Roman state, this chaos wasn't just inconvenient, it was unacceptable. In 312 CE, Constantine claimed a vision from the Christian God before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Whether that vision was divine or manufactured is besides the point. What matters is what happened after. Constantine converted, not out of spiritual conviction, but out of strategic calculation. Christianity had become too large to kill off, but too divided to rule. So he found the solution: unify it. In 325 CE, Constantine called the bishops together for the Council of Nicaea. This wasn't a spiritual revival, it was a theological lockdown. The emperor gathered the most powerful voices in the church and essentially said, pick one version of Christ. Everything else gets erased. It was here that the Nicene Creed was born, a strict outline of belief. Jesus was declared fully divine, of the same substance as God. The concept of the Trinity was reinforced, and all opposing views declared heresy. But let's be honest, this isn't about God. This was about empire. Eusebius, Constantine's court historian, said it plainly. The emperor summoned the General Assembly, determined to bring diverse beliefs into a single, universally accepted faith. That's not spiritual language, that's administrative, that's logistical, that's Roman. And it wasn't a one-time event. Over the next decades, through council after council, creed after creed, Christianity was reshaped to serve the state. Not the teachings of a wandering mystic, not the raw words of Jesus, but a version that would uphold hierarchy, obedience, and imperial order. By 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That was it. Debate over. From that point on, every other form of Christianity wasn't just unapproved, it was criminal. The edict read, we authorize followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians, but as for the others, we judge them to be heretics to suffer punishment by divine condemnation. No tolerance, no plurality, just law, just control, and if you held on to a different gospel, if you believed in a God who was within you rather than over you, you were no longer a seeker, you were an enemy of the state, and they acted like it. Texts were destroyed, churches were burned, teachers executed. What had once been a diverse spiritual ecosystem was now a monoculture. One book, one doctrine, one God, delivered to the people from the top down. But here's what most people miss. This wasn't just Rome defending a faith, it was Rome building one, piece by piece, not to liberate souls, but to control bodies, to assign spiritual loyalty with political loyalty, to merge theology with law. And they were smart about it. They preserved just enough of the original message to keep it familiar, just enough compassion to make it appealing, just enough mystery to give it weight. Behind the secret language was something cold, calculated, imperial. This wasn't about salvation, it was about submission. Christianity stopped being a path and became a product, a mechanism, a way to rule not just lands, but minds. But not everything was erased, not yet, because even as the official version spread, even as the canon was locked, there were still voices whispering underground, still teachings that refused to die. And eventually, some of them would rise back up, buried but not broken. Once Christianity became the official religion of Rome, the strategy shifted from building a system to securing it, by any means necessary. It wasn't enough to unify belief. Now, they had to enforce it. And that meant eliminating anything that didn't fit the script, literally. The early Christian world was full of texts, dozens of gospels, mystical writing, personal letters. Alternative scriptures passed from hand to hand, town to town. They were raw, diverse, and often wildly different from what would become the New Testament. But that freedom of thought, it was dangerous to the empire because it gave people choices, and choice disrupts control. So Rome responded the way empire always does, with fire. Let's start with Bishop Athanasius. At least I think that's how you say his name. One of the architects of orthodoxy. In his festal letter of 365 CE, he lays it out. These 27 books, no more, no less, are the only acceptable scriptures. This was the first time the New Testament canon was officially locked. But Athanasius didn't stop at naming texts. He gave orders to destroy everything else. He wrote, "No one may add anything to these writings or take anything away. The apocryphal writings are inventions of heretics." Inventions, heretics, not just incorrect, but dangerous, criminal. And that's how Rome treated them. Churches were raided, libraries torched, scrolls erased from existence. It wasn't a debate. It was an inquisition before the word existed. But if those texts were just nonsense, why fear them? Because they weren't nonsense. They were free, and freedom was a threat. These books told a different story, one where salvation wasn't through institutions, but inner awakening. One where Jesus was a guide, not a god to be worshipped. One where the divine didn't live in a temple or a book or a church, but in every person bold enough to look within. These weren't heresies, they were original voices, and the empire silenced them. They called it canonization, but it sounds more to me like colonization ideologically. It was censorship, and the texts that survived, even those weren't safe. Many of the books in the Bible were edited, redacted, rearranged, sometimes subtly, sometimes radically, passages added to reinforce doctrines, stories reshaped to fit the empire's agenda. Let's talk about Paul's letters, the foundation of Christian theology. Over time, scholars identified forgeries known as the pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus as later writings falsely attributed to Paul. These letters just so happen to reinforce hierarchy, male dominance, and institutional control. Coincidence? In earlier, more authentic letters, Paul speaks of women leading house churches. He talks about unity, mystery, and mystical experience. But suddenly, in these later letters, the message shifts. Now it's let women learn in silence. Now it's obey your elders. Now it's submit to authority. The voice of empire slipping into scripture. And then there's the Gospels themselves, written decades after Jesus' death, not by eyewitnesses, but by communities wrestling with persecution, politics, and survival. Each gospel has its own slant, its own agenda. Mark portrays a human Jesus who suffers. John gives a cosmic Christ who speaks like a Greek philosopher. Matthew rebrands Jesus as a fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. Luke smooths the narrative for a Gentile audience. Each text tailored for persuasion. Each one built to serve its readers and increasingly to serve the empire. And what didn't it serve? And what did it serve vanished. Entire gospels like the Gospel of Mary, which presents Mary Magdalene as a leader, keeper of secret knowledge, and spiritual equal to male disciples, erased. The Gospel of the Hebrews, known to early church fathers, lost. The Gospel of Ebenedes, the Gospel of Nazareth, all documented, all destroyed. We know these names not because they survived, but because the men who buried them left behind the shovels. Church fathers like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Epiphanius, don't even know how to say his name, they didn't just condemn these texts, they cataloged them, quoted them, argued with them, proved they existed, and then helped erase them. But erasure never works forever, because 1,000 years later in the deserts of Egypt, those voices would rise again. But we'll get to that. What matters now is this. The Bible we know today was not handed down from heaven. It was carved, censored, and curated by men, by councils, by empire. And what was lost may hold more truth than what survived. If you want to know what Christianity was really meant to be, don't just read what they preserved. Ask why they destroyed the rest. For over 1,000 years, the official version of Christianity stood uncontested, enforced by emperors, repeated by priests, and etched into the minds of billions. The Bible, sealed, the heretics silenced, the past rewritten. Until 1945. In the barren sands near the town of Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a farmer digging for fertilizer struck something hard. A clay jar, sealed. Inside, 13 ancient books, over 50 texts, most written in Coptic, leather-bound, untouched for centuries. This was no coincidence. These books had been hidden deliberately, not lost, protected from fire, from the empire. But when they were opened, everything changed. These weren't just old scrolls, they were gospels, dialogues, scriptures written by early Christian mystics, some dating back to the 2nd century. And they didn't just add to the story, they challenged its foundation. Let's start with the Gospel of Thomas. There's no crucifixion, there's no resurrection, and no divine punishment, just a series of sayings, direct, powerful, and stripped of myth. Jesus speaks like a Zen master, urging seekers inward. He says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. It's a quote that I mentioned in my previous videos as well. No salvation from above, no vicarious atonement, just you and the divine spark within you. That alone dismantles centuries of doctrine. Then there's the Apocryphon of John, a cosmic vision of creation that flips Genesis on its head. In this story, the God who made the world, Yaldabaoth, isn't the true God at all. He's a blind, arrogant impostor, the demiurge, a being who thinks he is supreme but was born of ignorance. Sound familiar? It's a direct assault on the God of the Old Testament, the jealous, wrathful God, the God of laws and punishments. In these texts, that God is not the Father of Jesus. He is a prison warden, a deceiver, a parasite feeding on worship. And what frees us from his grip? Gnosis, knowledge, direct insight, not belief, not obedience, experience. Now ask yourself, why was this buried? Because this version of Jesus doesn't serve an empire. He doesn't tell you to follow. He tells you to wake up. In the Gospel of Philip, we're told that the world we see is an illusion, that salvation isn't found through ritual, but through union of opposites, of inner masculine and feminine, of soul and spirit. In the Gospel of Mary, Mary Magdalene is shown not as a prostitute, but as a spiritual leader, closer to Jesus than any of the male disciples. She receives visions, she teaches, she is the only one who truly understands. And for that, Peter rejects her. Did he really speak with a woman in private and not openly to us? Peter asks. The male apostles argue. They're afraid, not of Mary, but of what she represents. Authority outside of hierarchy, revelation outside of tradition. These texts weren't vague, they were irrelevant. They weren't irrelevant, sorry. They were dangerous. They exposed the church not as a guardian of truth, but as one who buried it. And these weren't isolated ideas. The book of Thomas, the contender, the gospel of truth, the tripartite, tricate, all echo the same core message. The divine is not something you obey. It's something you remember, you reclaim, you become. So why were they destroyed? Why did the empire erase them? Because they offered freedom without permission. They told people they don't need temples, priests, or Rome. They need courage, vision, insight. They needed to remember who they were. That kind of message doesn't fill pews. It doesn't build kingdoms. It builds rebels, and it builds mystics, and it builds heretics. And heretics are hard to rule. So the texts were labeled lies. The authors condemned, the truth buried beneath doctrine, dogma, and fear. But now they've returned. And if you've been taught that Christianity has one voice, one book, one truth, read the Nag Hammadi texts. Read what Rome tried to erase. And ask yourself, which version actually sets you free? The empire may have fallen, the robes changed, the names changed, the symbols evolved, but the blueprint stayed. Once Rome had forged a weapon out of faith, it didn't vanish with the emperors, it was inherited, passed down, reinforced, repackaged for new rulers, new governments, new institutions, and today we're still living inside the aftermath. The problem isn't just what Christianity became, the problem is how its core texts were engineered to program obedience, not spiritual growth, not truth, but control. And if you trace it carefully, really look at the impact, you'll start to see it everywhere. Let's start with the New Testament. People often speak about it as if it's the pure heart of the Bible, the loving half. But it's in the New Testament where the most insidious rewrites happen. Because while the Old Testament framed law and punishment, the New Testament frames loyalty and submission, but cloaked in the language of love. Take Romans 13, often quoted to defend obedience to government. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. That line has been used to justify empires, monarchies, dictatorships, police states, and genocide. It's not a commandment from Christ, it's a tool of the state, planted in a sacred book to train generations to kneel. And who wrote it? Paul, a Roman citizen, a man who never walked with Jesus, but who rebranded the message of a rebel prophet into a gospel of passive endurance. Paul tells slaves to obey their masters. He tells women to be silent in churches. He tells the poor to be content. Over and over again, his writings preach hierarchy, order, self-denial, and faith in suffering. That's not liberation, that's domestication. Even worse, many of the letters attributed to Paul aren't his. Modern scholars widely agree that at least 7 of the Pauline epistles were forgeries written after his death to cement church authority, enforce gender roles, and eliminate dissent. And yet these letters are quoted as divine truth. Now consider this. The Bible was the first book mass printed in the Western world. Its message became the moral foundation for entire civilizations. Laws, ethics, economies, shaped not by the words of Jesus, but by the words Rome allowed through. The result? A society that teaches virtue is obedience, that authority is sacred, that suffering is holy, that freedom is a sin. This mindset didn't just stay in churches, it bled into every institution that grew out of them. The family, the school, the government, the military, the workplace. Authority becomes father. Church becomes conscience. Nation becomes God. And no matter where you turn, you're told the same thing. Obey, believe, be good, and maybe, if you're lucky, you'll be rewarded later. But where does that idea come from? Not from the Gnostic texts, not from the mystics, not from the original seekers who spoke of inner light, divine knowledge, and freedom of illusion. It came from Rome that wanted bodies in line, souls tamed, and minds too afraid to ask. So let's be honest about where we stand. We inherited a religion designed by an empire. It was edited, redacted, and repurposed for dominance. And while we can argue all day about theology, about doctrine, about what this or that verse really means, the deeper truth is this. We were never supposed to think for ourselves. That was the point of the rewrite, but the cracks are showing. More people than ever are asking questions, rereading the text, discovering the voices that were buried. The world is shifting and the old lies are starting to feel hollow. Because when the truth is buried, it doesn't die. It waits patiently, quietly, until someone's ready to dig. The empire thought it had the final word. The church thought it had sealed the story. For centuries, they controlled the narrative through doctrine, through war, through fear, but no lie lasts forever. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts wasn't just an archaeological miracle, it was a rupture, a break in the dam. After 1,600 years of silence, the voices they tried to erase started speaking again. And the message? You are not fallen. You are not broken. You are not born in sin. You are divine. This is the core of the ancient Gnostic vision, a vision that outlived fire, persecution, and centuries of exile. A vision that sees humanity not as subjects of wrath, but as sparks of the eternal, fragments of a greater light, trapped in flesh, asleep inside a system designed to keep you numb. In the Gnostic myth, the demiurge, the false god, the jealous god, the creator of the flawed material world, builds a system of illusion, laws, rituals, suffering, guilt. He calls himself the only God. He demands worship, but he is not the source. He is a tyrant pretending to be divine. Sound familiar? It's not just mythology. It's allegory. It's a map. The Gnostics weren't describing some far-off demon. They were describing the empire. the church, Rome, the system that hijacked truth, rewrote scripture, and replaced awakening with obedience. And yet, beneath all of that, something survived. A whisper, a spark, a memory buried in bone, that you are the temple, you are the sacred text, you are the kingdom. The Gnostic Jesus never told people to worship him. He told them to wake up, to remember, to become what they already were. But to get there, you have to unlearn everything you were taught to fear. You have to stop mistaking submission for virtue. You have to stop mistaking tradition for truth. You have to stop kneeling to a story that was written to keep you small. Because here's the truth. The version of Christianity we inherited wasn't handed down from heaven. It was manufactured by men. Men in robes, men with armies, men who saw divinity as a throne to sit on, not a mystery to awaken within. And that version, it's coming back. People are waking up, not just spiritually, but historically. They're questioning the canon. They're reading the banned books. They're hearing, maybe for the first time, the voice of Jesus, who didn't ask for worship. He asked for transformation. He didn't die to save you. He lived to show you who you are. The system buried that. The empire outlawed that. But the truth has never needed permission to rise. And now, here we are, at the edge of a new remembering. You are not here to obey. You are not here to wait for redemption. You are here to awaken, to reclaim the path they tried to erase, to burn through illusion, to become the very thing the empire feared most, free, aware, and divine. This is not just a spiritual realization. It's a rebellion. It's a resurrection, not of flesh, but of spirit and idea and fire. I hope everybody enjoyed my presentation. If you guys liked this kind of content and information, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed and liked the video. And if you have any thoughts, you have anything to contribute, please leave it in the comments and I'll respond. Or if you want me to cover something in a future video, just leave it in the comments. I love you guys. Thank you all for watching, and I will see everyone in the next video.